Well, hello, and thank you for joining the Assembly of First Nations second virtual information session. Before we start today's session, I would like to welcome Elder Edmund Sackney to open today's session in a good way. So, Elder, if you can come on screen and start us off, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, Miss Lee. I don't know why my picture is the way it is, but anyway. Matiga nakaskaho namojamak nagokamak chako utagata chik pita bego. Ogamagna nesta kinoa. Antikaya biek tuta anama. Nakaskaho namojamak ogamak chako. I don't know why my picture is like this, but I'd like to take this time to acknowledge the spiritual grannies and grandpas of my area, my community, Beta Bagel. And also, I encourage all of you, wherever you may be at, to do the same. Anano Taono, Kishamanto, into our great Father, our great Creator, our great Spirit. Nagachahena, Kapecha Nagashkatiach Nagasko, Ota. To look after us as we meet for a short period. Olamaganesta, Richin, and Kayamaya, Ute Uche. And also to help us out as we speak from our hearts. And to all of you, I offer my thank you for your efforts of being here. Ayamek, speak, Oyasbu, in a good way. Ogabaganesta, Anochitaya, Anama, Msui, Mwashakuchi, and for dealing with the issues that involves all our children, from infants to toddlers, youth. Ogamaganesta, Nagache, Anaganiganichi, Turtle Island at Donoa, Mekawana. Anyway, just to all our leaders, I pray for all our leaders this morning, wherever they may be, right across Turtle Island. Ogamaganesta, Nagahabatizichik, Kanuchitachik, Oma, Washijak, and for those workers that are involved with childcare and at every age. Omaganesta miswebunichinuak mutiche homapamatiswan. Ogamaganesta anagachik. Ojakuchi. And also to all our adults, our parents, grandparents who are walking this earth. So as they look after the new ones, the toddlers, the infants, and the youth, look after them. Neto Anna Kishamantu, I ask the great creator to look after them. Egote, Nagashkatya, Emiek. Okay, so you can start meeting and start speaking. Thank you. Miigwech.
Thank you, Miigwech, Elder Ed, for your opening prayers and words. I would now like to turn the session over to National Chief Cindy Woodhouse-Nepenak to provide welcoming remarks.
Anin, Buju, Miigwech for coming here today. I'm joining you live from Treaty 6 territory. I won't be able to put my video on because I'm having technical difficulties. Can you hear me? Oh, yeah. Hello?
Yeah, we can hear National Chief.
Okay, thank you. And thank you all so much for joining. I know that this is a good day. I want to wish you all well. I hope you're having a good summer. As I said, I'm coming to you live from Treaty 6 territory. I want to thank Knowledge Keeper Ed for starting us off in a good way this morning. And we continue to ask our elders to pray for us and guide us in, excuse me, in a good way, and to make sure that we're on the right path and leading for our children, right? As the first mother, like the first national chief that's a mom, I always think of our kids first. I always think that, and I always remember many of my friends that have gone through the child welfare system, that have had a tough time, that have tried to get back their kids and running through hoop after hoop after hoop. And it's been a really tough system on our people from the time since residential school started. And it's always been about our kids. And so I know that we have a lot to go through. I know I want to thank the staff for their many pages of speaking notes, but I just wanted to speak from my heart this morning and say we have a big decision before us. We've been negotiating for a long time. I want to thank all the people over the many, many years that have been pushing this issue, that have been fighting this issue, that have been in courts, at the CHRT, fighting. I'm so proud of all of them, each and every one of them, like Dr. Phil Fontaine, Dr. Cindy Blackstock, all these people that came before me, Harry Bellegarde, many people that have been on this issue for a long time before I came on. And I know that as of recently, I've been at the negotiating table and bugging the Prime Minister, talking to the cabinet to make sure that they give us fair deals. And I think that this is a fair deal. And as National Chief, I can assure you that we've talked to everybody in government about this. Even though we're negotiating, we're doing the political work on the side to try and get this done. And we're happy to report that we have before our First Nations leadership $47.8 billion 10-year draft agreement that chiefs can consider for the fall. And I know that there's lots to discuss and deliberate, but one thing I can assure our chiefs is that funding will go directly to First Nations. And if First Nations can delegate that to either an authority or back to the provinces, but this needs to be First Nations led, First Nations controlled. It's so important that First Nations be in the driver's seat of this. For far too long, too many people have taken advantage of us, have created systems that maybe pieces of them work, maybe pieces of them don't work for us. And it's important that we restore our families once again in our First Nations communities, that we build infrastructure to help our families, that we bring our people back together. It's going to be tough work and hard work over the next decade, but I think that we can do it together. We all need each other. We need all of our capacity to come together to make this successful. And I know First Nations will be at different points. Some may be farther ahead, others may be coming along and thinking about how they want to design.
National Chief, you're breaking up.
Right now to change the trajectory of our families' lives. Oh, so I'll leave it there. But I know that it's. I apologize for my audio this morning, and I'll see you next time we have a webinar. And we invite you to come to Winnipeg, September 17th, 18th, and 19th. And we look forward to working with all of you. I want to commend our legal team. I want to commend our staff and all the parties involved in this. It wasn't just the AFN, it was many other people. And we commend each and every one of you. We lift you all up in a good way. With that, miigwech, hi.
Thank you, National Chief, for your words to start off our session today. I would like to welcome you all again to the second virtual information session on long-term reform of First Nations Child and Family Services, or FNCFS. My name is Lauren Dockstader, and I am the Acting Director of Social Development at the Assembly of First Nations. I'm a mother, wife, and a member of Six Nations of the Grand River Bay of Quinte Mohawk Band. Today, I will also be the moderator for this session. So this session is streaming from unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, and I'm joining you from Bwating Territory, homeland of the Anishinaabe of Batchewana and Garden River First Nations. Today's session is the second in a series of virtual gatherings that the Assembly of First Nations is hosting over the summer to provide you with more information about the draft agreement on long-term reform of the FNCFS program. In our first session, we heard from AFN General Counsel Stuart Watkey, who shared a high-level overview of the draft agreement and the funding components that make up the $47.8 billion agreement. For those of you who were unable to attend, or if you would like to review the materials that were presented, I encourage you to visit the AFN's website to access the recording and resources from the first session. The recording and presentation materials from today's session will also be posted on the AFN's website. Today's session will focus on the elements of the agreement pertaining to protection. We will hear from AFN Senior Policy Analyst on Child and Family Services, Ashley DeLay. Ashley will review the sections of the agreement that focus on protection, including operations and maintenance, child service purchase, legal fees, and least disruptive measures. After this presentation, we'll open up the session to questions and answers submitted by you, viewers at home. You can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen at any time to send a question that may be posed to Ashley during the question and answer period. You can also use the chat function to share any reflections or feedback on the presentation or the agreement sections. But for any questions, I ask that you please use the Q&A button, or they might not be answered if they're put in the chat. There will be a lot of information shared during today's session. So if a question comes to mind following the session, you can email us at social.development@afn.ca to follow up on any of the content we have presented today. That email address is also found on our website. There's translation available in these sessions in English and French. You can select the language you would like to hear in today's session by using the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, I'd like to pass the floor over to Ashley to introduce herself and begin today's presentation.
Good morning all, thank you so much for joining us today. I just very thankful for this opportunity to speak on these topics. As Lauren introduced me, I'm Ashley DeLay. I'm the Senior Policy Analyst on the Child and Family Services file at the Assembly of First Nations. Tomorrow actually marks 3 years since I've been at the AFN. But since, although I've been working on this reform of child and family services at the AFN for the last 3 years, I've also been working kind of very much in the background for probably the better part of a decade. First, sort of getting my feet wet as a master's student in social work at McGill University, at the Research Center, and then continuing to work in research, and I've had the privilege to work and publish on child and family services and First Nations child and family services. My own background, I was born in Treaty 7 territory in Calgary, and now live in Ottawa. And I'm not First Nations, but I'm very privileged to be able to work on this and support this work in whatever way I can. And so I also want to thank Elder Ed for his opening prayer. Elder Ed has been an incredible support to our team, to myself, in fact, through much of this journey. And he's provided me with a lot of, and our team with a lot of encouragement, and his professional experience too has given us quite a lot to build from as well. So I really want to say thank you to Elder Ed. Also, thank you to National Chief for her introduction and for her dedication to this work. It's been an honor to work with the National Chief, first as the portfolio holder on this file, and as when she was Regional Chief, and now as National Chief. And it's a great experience to be able to support this work at the national level. And most of all, thank you to everyone who's joined Chief's leadership, child and family services workers, to learn more about the draft agreement and on funding for protection under what we call the baseline. And I'll get into that those details in a few moments. As Lauren mentioned, this is the second in a series of information sessions and this one will focus on that protection and baseline funding aspect. So I'm just going to open up the deck here, and I will look for a thumbs up from the IT team on or from Lauren to see how this is looking from everyone else's perspective. All right.
Looks good.
Right. So before we dive into the details of baseline funding or protection funding, I just want to do a quick overview of the draft agreement and for long-term reform. The draft agreement commits Canada to $47.8 billion in investment money, new money for child and family services. So this is not repurposed money, and it will flow directly to First Nations and agencies over the space of 10 years to address the long-standing funding gaps, such as lack of prevention, funding, and ongoing, and it will also provide ongoing capital infrastructure funding. Excuse me. It also secures funding for areas not in the CHRT orders, but that which we've negotiated for on top, including securing ongoing funding for post-majority services and for the delivery of First Nations representative services, which is known as band rep in Ontario. So that service, which is there to support the First Nations and families who are involved in child and family services, that service will be available on a national basis as opposed to just an Ontario service. There's also a funding, an additional $1.79 billion. It was $2 billion, but that funding began in 2023, 2024. So that housing investment will be continued with if the draft agreement is accepted. This funding will be ring-fenced in what's known as a special purpose allotment, which is a method of safeguarding the funds by sending strong signals to the federal government, to Indigenous Services Canada and Treasury Board, and also any successor departments, that the money should not be repurposed. The strength of the funding too, is really that the funding mechanism outlined in the draft agreement is flexibility, and it's to respond to the child and family services needs and wellness priorities of the First Nations that agencies serve, and First Nations through their ability to reallocate funding within the program. So this means that agencies and First Nations can reallocate funding to areas of priority that they would like to address. And it won't look the same for everybody, for every First Nations and every community. We may have some communities want to invest more of their FNCFS funding into housing to support child and family service or children and families, and others may want to focus more of their funding on prevention activities. The draft agreement enables that flexibility and that decision making, and I'll touch more on that in today's presentation. Other longstanding gaps in FNCFS funding that the draft agreement addresses is inflation. Historically, FNCFS has not been subject to inflation, so funding has not kept up with the true costs of goods and services. The draft agreement has inflation based on the Consumer Price Index, which was the recommendations of many, but specifically the National Advisory Committee really endorsed inflation indexed by the Consumer Price Index, as well as our research partners at the IFSD, again, which I'll touch on further on. So because FNCFS funding was not subject to inflation, the funding hasn't really kept up with the true costs of goods and services. And the funding will be adjusted annually using the CPI. I also know that many people are wondering about what happens after the 10-year point. We know that the agreement lasts for 10 years, and the question is, what happens after that? FNCFS will still exist. There's always going to be a need for protection and prevention services. But the draft agreement has two program assessments sort of at 2 5-year intervals. And these program assessments will be conducted by independent program assessment experts. The funding will still be there, but the model and mechanism past year 10 especially will be based on the recommendations of the program assessment, including consideration for whether or not FNCFS funding should be delivered through legislation, similar to the way that provincial and territorial funding transfers work. The draft agreement also includes funding for First Nations to spend on housing, as I mentioned, and it's specifically for the purpose of keeping children at home with their families or reuniting children in care with their families when housing is a barrier. We do know that sometimes children sort of get stuck in the care system because housing is a barrier to return. So that's something I know some First Nations are particularly interested in developing, sort of transitional housing or reunification housings to make sure that children are returning home to, with their families to a safe and suitable environment. The draft agreement also includes a First Nations-led dispute mechanism with the ability to make binding orders on Canada, and that will be established if the agreement is accepted. The dispute mechanism will be covered more extensively in the final virtual information session on Thursday, September 5th. So I'll now shift focus to the FNCFS funding model, in particular the baseline funding. So for nearly 3 years, the research team at the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy conducted research that was directed by the AFN to help design options for a new funding model that would respond to the priorities of First Nations. The IFSD's work included research participants from agencies and First Nations, and many expressed how difficult it was to provide services in a funding environment that was rigid, lacked growth, was uncertain and unstable. To address these challenges, the funding mechanism proposed by the draft agreement is premised on these principles of flexibility, stability, and predictability. Flexibility means that First Nations service providers, meaning agencies and First Nations or other organizations with a mandate to provide services to First Nations, are able to reallocate funds across expenditure categories within the FNCFS program. The result of that flexibility is that funding can be moved around to best meet the needs, the wellness priorities of First Nations and of children and families, even within the fiscal year. Agencies can leverage this flexibility to be proactive rather than reactive to new and emerging priorities. If the draft agreement is approved, the first year of baseline funding, which I'll break down further in a few minutes, will begin on April 1st, 2025. This funding is the actual expenditures reported by the agency for fiscal year 2022-2023 for its full operations and maintenance costs, and then adjusted for inflation using CPI and population counts. I know that some might be wondering why 2022-2023. That's the most recent year for which agency expenditures are available. So we can get into a bit more maybe in the question and answer period, but that's just to answer that first question that might come to mind for some. Agencies will have the stability in their funding, so year over year with this formula that builds on their actual expenditures and is adjusted with inflation and population growth, and to keep pace with actual costs. The draft agreement is also specific. It affirms that agencies will not see a reduction in their baseline for the duration of this agreement. Being able to predict future funding amounts provides agencies with the opportunity to plan ahead, plan for growth and innovation in service delivery. A flexible, stable, and predictable funding environment means that agencies are better able to grow, plan, innovate. It also means better outcomes for children and families who need the services services that the agencies provide, including like the programs and supports that are available this year and will be are sure to be available in the years to come. So as I touched on in the last slide, the baseline funding that agencies will receive will begin as the actual expenditures reported by the agency for fiscal year 2022-2023, and then adjusted for inflation using CPI and for population. Going forward for the first 5-year period, the baseline will be adjusted annually for inflation and population and will not be subject to reduction. Baseline funding over years 6 to 10 will be subject to the 5-year program assessment, but will remain stable. The baseline includes all of the expenditures reported by an agency, including their expenditures for least disruptive measures, also known as tertiary prevention, and I will discuss that in more detail in the next slides. The baseline includes expenditure categories for agencies' day-to-day operations, such as staff salaries, building maintenance, cost of IT, utilities, vehicles, mileage, any of these kinds of things that just support the day-to-day operations of the agencies, keeping the lights on, that kind of thing. Baseline also includes the agencies, what the agencies spent on protection activities. So that would be areas like intake and investigation, taking a child into care when necessary, and the costs associated with that mandate, the purchase of specialized services for children in care or those receiving least disruptive measures, and then the costs associated with providing least disruptive measures to children and families, as well as any legal fees. This is just an illustration. It's not meant to be exhaustive, but these are just some of the categories that most agencies will have in their expenditures. So carry forwards also is known as carryover, carry forwards. It's sort of depends on your preference of language. But the agreement also contains provisions for the ability to carry forward any unexpended funding. If I say unexpected funding, I really mean unexpended funding. It's just an easy slip of the tongue that I seem to make a lot. It's important to the AFN to ensure that funding recipients have some time to plan how to use this new money. We know that some agencies struggle to spend all of their annual funding due to staffing shortage, some, not all, and still even have surpluses remaining from COVID shutdowns or other reasons outside of their control. We also know that sometimes agencies find themselves in a position of, having to spend money at the end of the fiscal year, and the sort of that use it or lose it mentality of the current funding model. This is not a sustainable model. It's not a great way to spend money. So we want to make sure that the opportunity to carry forward is. Oh, sorry, I just lost my screen. We know that the opportunity to carry forward is important so that we can also, so that agencies and First Nations can plan ahead. You might want to earmark funding for future spending, for future programs, and that will be allowed in the funding model if the draft agreement is approved. This carry forward leads into the principles of predictability and flexibility. Agencies and First Nations will be able to use their funding how they see fit, and it may sometimes mean carrying over this funding. So there's some terminology that I would like to unpack with you today. So least disruptive measures is the term used in the draft agreement to describe the services required by provincial or territorial legislation for the kind of intensive intervention activities aimed at keeping families together when risk of maltreatment or apprehension is high. Least disruptive measures are also commonly referred to as tertiary prevention services. that also known in different provincial legislation might be called family enhancement or least intrusive measures. These services generally require oversight from a CFS professional or CFS professionals with a recognized designation, such as registered social worker, psychologist, psychiatrist, occupational therapist, and so on. While least disruptive measures are part of the broader scope of prevention, only agencies will be funded for this type of prevention. Funding for these activities will be included in the baseline allocated to the agency. To further sort of unpack this, I would also just to review the terminology used in the draft agreement, the least disruptive measures terminology versus prevention funding. So as I mentioned, least disruptive measures are these types of broadly prevention services required by provincial or territorial child welfare legislation. These services aim to keep families together or reunite if a child has necessarily been taken into care. And because these services generally require intervention by a professional CFS worker, again, only agencies will be able to provide this service, and only agencies will be able to receive funding for these services. That contrasted with prevention services that First Nations will receive funding for. So that the types of prevention services that First Nations will receive funding for are those primary and secondary prevention types of services. These are the types of programs and services aimed at mitigating the contextual factors that we know to be the drivers of overrepresentation of First Nations children and child welfare, which is often associated to things like housing and food insecurity, lack of supervision due to scarcity of childcare, need for material items such as appropriate winter clothing, and other factors outside the control of the caregiver. Secondary prevention, which often addresses family or small group needs, would be those that meeting the needs of those families or small groups, but does not meet a threshold for requiring protection services or that least disruptive measures by the agency. Some of these, in additional activities, funding can be used for things like cultural land-based activities that are meant to build on resilience and also foster community cohesion. So this will be discussed again in more detail in the next virtual engagement info session, rather, on Thursday, August 22nd. So just to go back just to clarify, we really want to clarify that the terminology used in the agreement, the draft agreement, is really just to differentiate and delineate these two types of least disruptive measures as that that mandated prevention service that the agency has at that sort of that higher level, that tertiary level, and then versus the community-based services that the First Nation will be funded for. It's a difference in terminology to just really make clear how the expectations and roles and responsibilities that come with that funding. So the part of that delineation of roles and responsibilities is this child and community wellness plan, which you can view a draft template of in appendix, I believe it's appendix 5 in the draft agreement. And it's a template to support the First Nation and the affiliated agency to delineate those roles and responsibilities. This wellness plan is also meant to foster a collaborative relationship between the agency and First Nation. We know that some First Nations have great relationships with their agency, and we know that some First Nations and agencies don't have great relationships. And what we're hoping to do with the draft agreement, and hoping that people will see the strength of it in the draft agreement, is that this collaborative relationship, that can be fostered to better to better enmesh the services that will be available, and have sort of like that tighter enmeshment of that social security net, and that cultural supports and financial supports, anything that sort of comes from these service agreements, and that the agency and the First Nation can then develop that collaborative relationship, but also delineate who is responsible for delivering what. So the other aspect of this child and family services, or the child and community wellness plan, is to also redirect the accountability relationship from the agency, which under the current model is towards Indigenous Services Canada and not towards the First Nation that they serve. So this approach really redirects that accountability relationship. That's what we would like to foster in that, so that it's the First Nation in the driver's seat, but also working very closely with their agency. And again, we're going to review this in greater detail in the final virtual information session, which will have to do with performance measurement, accountability, and governance. So, excuse me, will I just take a moment? So the final aspect I'd like to share with you today is the FNCFS service provider funding adjustment provisions. I know that it's a fair question to ask. What if the baseline is not enough? It's if the questions and some insecurities about the sufficiency of a baseline. So what we wanted to ensure is that there is a mechanism so that if a agency or First Nation finds they just don't have enough money in their funding allocation, that there's a method to request a service provider funding adjustment from Indigenous Services Canada. Though a lot of number crunching has gone into the draft agreement, there of course may be a need for reevaluation of baseline funding, whether it's this year or in years to come, or in the future being next fiscal year. So in this process, if a service provider is finding that they don't have sufficient funds in their allocation, they can go through the service provider funding adjustment just by requesting in writing to Indigenous Services Canada for this process. And it can be for a single year, which could deal with sort of an unexpected and rather extreme sort of change in the service environment that is expected to be temporary, or it could be something like a multi-year. So, for example, if you have an influx or like a growth in the population for the First Nations that you serve, that would be part of that could be part of your, reasons for requesting a service provider adjustment. So, and ISC has guardrails for response to these. They must respond to a service provider funding adjustment request within 30 days. And actually less if there's a significant risk to the children and families that the agency is providing services to. So this is just one of the many safeguards that the draft agreement builds in to ensure that children, families, and communities are supported, and that the reforms are responding to the needs identified by First Nations and in collaboration with our agencies. Again, we'll explore more of this accountability measures and that relationship in the final information session on September 5th. So I'll now pass it over to Lauren to start the question and answer. I'll just say, if I'm not able to answer a question, we can absolutely follow up. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not a politician. I'm a policy analyst. My specialty is FNCFS, but I'll do my best. And if we're not able to answer your questions today, we'll follow up with you, and you also can email us at thesocial.development@afn.ca. So take it away, Lauren.
Thank you, Ashley, for your presentation. These are all really incredibly important elements to understand about the draft agreement to see how it will impact our children and families and the services and funding that will be available to support them. A lot of technical information that you covered there. So, it went by really quickly, and I know our time today is much longer, so we have about over an hour for any questions for Ashley that anybody has today. So as a reminder, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit a question to Ashley. As well, the presentation and recording today will be available in both English and French. And again, that will be uploaded onto the AFN's website as soon as possible for your information and any other materials that you may need about today's session or past previous sessions. But there is one question here, Ashley, for you. How does protection work for Ontario agencies, especially with the 1965 agreement? Are you able to provide some commentary on that?
It's a difficult one because the Ontario specific parts of the agreement were negotiated by the Ontario First Nations, so that would be Chiefs of Ontario and Nishnawbe-Aski Nation. So, and I also know that the 1965 agreement is also up for review and reform. So, but what I do know is that the it is outlined, the protection is outlined in the draft or in the draft agreement. And given that there's sort of the way that agencies and work in Ontario is slightly different from the rest of Canada. It is like there is that specific nuance. I'm wondering if the person who's asked that question can maybe break down a little bit more of like, is it that, are they wondering about where the funding will go by the province? Like, is it that they're thinking about how the province will get that funding, or if there's a more specific question like within that?
Okay, well, to the person giving the question, if you can find the time to add more detail or description, we'll certainly bring that up for conversation. We also have another question. Has the 1.8 billion for housing been allocated, or is this not going to be allocated until the agreement is finalized?
So the first sort of allocation went out in this past fiscal year, so 2023, 2024. But under the draft agreement, the housing funding will be allocated directly to the First Nation, but it's going to be administered through the Capital Maintenance and Infrastructure Program at ISK. And they're going to develop sort of a special sub program for that housing funds. And the allocation is going to be based on population, ultimately on population, and some other factors like the housing, the state of housing, which was based on census information. So kind of get to know roughly what the housing need is for each First Nation. So that is going to be, so it's not all the money has been allocated. There's still some that's like sitting sort of waiting. The housing funding though has been contingent on this draft agreement going forward. If that answers that part of that question.
Thanks, Ashley. Can you further clarify the flexibility to reallocate funds across expenditure categories?
Sure. So the way that you may have seen other information talk about you have expenditure categories. So you'll receive funding, whether you're an agency or the First Nation, you'll receive funding for your expenditure categories, and it'll be notionally allocated. So roughly based on what your previous year's expenditures look like. But it's really up to then the agency or basically the recipient to say, hey, like, actually, we notice that we have more need. So if you're an agency and you say, like, we actually could move money over from our sort of like our protection funding, so that what you have spent on maintaining children in care, making sure that they have like the services they need, all of the funding associated with maintaining a child in care, you could move it over to your least disruptive measures or your tertiary prevention programs, to try to support that goal of keeping kids out of care, but making sure that there's enough and there's sufficient programming. Maybe you'll see that there's a program you'd like to offer, but you haven't been able to, develop that funding stream. So this might give you an opportunity to start moving money over, and you can do that within the fiscal year too. So you can kind of, like I said, like be proactive, or even react more quickly if there's something that, if there's something that comes up in your community, the communities that you serve, and you have a need for more money just to provide a specific type of intervention, you can do that without like at your sort of at your prerogative and within consultation with the First Nation as well.
Thanks for that. Just a reminder to the participants, please, if you have any questions, please insert them in the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Ashley, you mentioned a question came in. You mentioned that part of the effort was to restore accountability of agencies to First Nations. In the draft agreement, my interpretation is that agencies will be reporting to ISK, who then reports to the First Nation, paragraphs 135 to 144. This would insert ISK between the agency and First Nation. Is that correct?
So part of that collaborative relationship that's sort of was envisioned in the draft agreement is that the reporting that the agency has to do to ISK, has to provide to ISK, is for the funding that they receive, and it's for ISK's. They have to report to Treasury and to central agencies on that funding to sort of justify the money that's going out. So we can't get around that. That money, that kind of those kind of reporting has to continue to fund this program and make it, make the argument to central agencies that like this funding is needed. They need to have some data back. However, the data or the reporting that the agency has to provide to ISK is pretty high level. It's definitely not individualized, and it has to be first shared with the First Nation. And though the responsibility is on the agency to provide that reporting to Indigenous Services Canada, the First Nation has to be in collaboration with the First Nation. We do want to take that approach that this is data. This data is about the First Nations children, and it belongs to the First Nation. But in order for the program to continue to be funded, especially at this level, and thinking about a possible change in government to a fiscally conservative government, we really need to make sure that like the measurement that is there to justify the kinds of funding that we've advocated for. There is a set of indicators and a set of reporting that has to do with the well-being of the child in care. That does not go to Indigenous Services Canada. That goes to the First Nations. So these are questions like, how are our children doing in care? Are they receiving the kinds of services we want them to receive? Are they having opportunities to do to attend ceremony? Are they able to attend cultural events on their community? Are they maintaining their relationships? Are they attending school? How difficult is it for them to access school? These kinds of questions that really are for the First Nation to know. And that's part of that accountability piece too. So if a child is taken into care, the First Nation can say like, hey, we're really valuing like that our children, even if they have to be in care, necessarily have to be in care, that they continue to maintain a relationship with their community through culture, through ceremony, through feasting, however it is that whatever the priority is that the First Nation sets. And that reporting will go to the First Nation. And there's also a support built in on top of that through a regional secretariat, which will be there to support the agency and First Nation in doing that kind of reporting. And that can actually, what we're hoping to see is that a secretariat, this like a data secretariat and a best practices secretariat will then be able to pull together anonymized data from across all different First Nations jurisdictions to start creating a picture of how children are doing while they're in care. And that'll be available to the First Nation at the First Nation level, but then also on like sort of an ever expanding circle, so that this is so we can, so the First Nations can really see what is working. I think that's something that I've heard from First Nations with regards to data and reporting is, getting away from the idea of like the deficit narrative, what doesn't work, only knowing about the problems and not knowing about what is working, what the strengths are, and what can be built on. And I think that's part of the strength of the draft agreement, the strength of the reporting requirements. So though there's a limited number of requirements for the agency to provide to ISK to continue to justify this program to the government and to continue to justify the level of investment, it's going to be primarily reporting to the First Nation. I hope that answers that question. I probably maybe even created more questions, but yeah.
Well, thank you for the very informative response. Another question is, why is the baseline amount based on the 2022-23 fiscal year? Why not use a more recent year?
So because I agree. I wish that the most the most recent fiscal year would be available. However, it is the most it is the complete that's the most complete expenditures, FNCFS expenditures that Indigenous Services Canada has from agencies. So we can't build a picture on the most recent fiscal year because that information doesn't currently exist, unfortunately. So I wish I could tell you. I wish I could tell you, oh yes, no, I made a mistake, but unfortunately it is 2022, 2023, and it has to do with a limitation in how fast expenditure data can come back and get analyzed. It's a good question for ISK though.
Thank you. In your introduction, you said that the $47 billion is new money, but since this includes the baseline funding, is some of this money already exist?
So the funding is so if you're an agency, you may remember in the previous couple of fiscal years, there probably was a lot of communication from Indigenous Services Canada. Everybody's been working on actuals. So that was reimbursement. So that was an effort to try and collect this expenditure data. So agencies have been working largely on actuals through reimbursements. So this is that was sort of a little bit of a data collecting exercise, and now the investment, and it's been, we've been working on this, as I said, like for a number of years, and the IFSD has done a lot of support on costing out reform. So we know that the investment required for the suite of reforms is going to require new money, and that actually is a CHRT order to can't be repurposing money from other programs. So that's part of what that new money means. They're not going to be taking money from early learning and childcare. They're not going to be taking money from other programs and services offered by Indigenous Services Canada to fund this. It has to be new money. That is part of the orders. So the orders were for a sort of a smaller suite of reform, but we've expanded that based on the research we've, that we have directed from the IFSD, and also based on, what First Nations have been telling us, what agencies have been telling us. So that funding is new money based on the actuals, the reimbursements. So that information that has been collected over the last few years on agency expenditures. I hope that helps clarify that question.
All right, thank you. And I'll just catch your breath for a minute, and just send a reminder out to those of you who are watching of your screen, as well as if you have any questions that you might want to ask later or come across later, you can feel free to email social.development@afn.ca, and we'll certainly send a response and provide you with some additional information. We have another question. So for those cultural supports that an agency is already providing to children, funding will also be provided to the First Nation to offer those services?
So if an agency, so this is what I think, this is where that community, at Child and Community plan really comes into play. If you're an agency and you're offering cultural services, you're facilitating that or having services available through your organization, the First Nations you serve want to continue that program, they can sort of kick that money over to you if that's the desire from the First Nation. Some First Nations, like I said, want to continue this relationship. They also may decide like this is not in our best interest, like to be doing this kind of work right now, and may have other priorities and want the agency to continue that work. So that's something that I suggest you'll talk to the First Nation about, because the funding for those kinds of activities will go to the First Nation. And what I would encourage you, because of course, every agency, this is the way I've discussed the baseline is a very, very broad, look at how baseline funding and like that tertiary prevention will work under that baseline. But the way that your agency works currently with your First Nation and the funding agreements you have, that starts to get into like a level of granularity I don't have access to that kind of information. So you'll need to sort of start collaborating, talking to the First Nations you serve, talking to ISK in your region about what you can expect. I do know that ISK will be providing information about your baseline in the coming weeks, coming months. So you'll kind of know what to expect. Of course, this is all contingent on whether or not this agreement will be accepted. We're doing information sessions, engagement sessions, so people can learn about it, and so that chiefs and leaderships can then make a call on whether or not to accept this agreement during the Special Chiefs Assembly in September. So everything I say, just want to caveat that it's dependent on this on the acceptance of the agreement. So for your particular agency in that particular situation, I would say now's the time. Talk to your First Nation. What do they want to do? They want you to continue to offer those services? Do they want to do some of the services? That's really that's where that community child and community wellness plan is going to come into play.
Thank you. So this question kind of it's actually related to what you had just mentioned, searching for more clarity. Is it the case that First Nations will not be funded for least disruptive measures, but will receive funding for prevention, and the funding that First Nations receive for prevention does include funding for protection?
No.
Or are only agencies funded for protection?
Only agencies are funded for protection. Of course, it has to align with your provincial mandates, your provincial legislation. So, a First Nation, unless they're a C92 First Nation and they're setting up their own agencies, which is a different question altogether, a different sort of process. I think you would know if your First Nation is going on that path. But if you are a mandated agency, delegated agency, you are the only organization that can provide protection and least disruptive measures. Point final. Like there's the First Nation doesn't have, let's say, like the protection mandate. It doesn't have a protection mandate unless they are starting to create their own laws under the C-92 process. So only the agency will receive funding for protection and funding for the least disruptive measures. So those are the prevention activities requiring a registered social worker, requiring clinical supervision, requiring that sort of those more intensive intensive intervention that only agencies can offer. The First Nation will receive the funding for prevention activities at the community level. So we know that some First Nations have funding agreements with Indigenous Services Canada to do this kind of work already, this prevention work already, but that it doesn't exist across all First Nations. So that's what part of this agreement does, is it ensures that there is, equanimity around that all First Nations receive the money to implement, whether they do it themselves or whether they ask their agency to do it for them or do part of it. Maybe they want to do a little bit of this and the agency does a different, some other prevention activities. But those are those kinds of community-based activities that quite frankly exist in urban centers, those kinds of like community support networks, food banks, sometimes like clothing banks, any kind of even like I'm going to hear of some people who are doing things like regular community feasting as a way to like build on the resilience that First Nations communities already have and build up that community cohesion. And thinking about that, for cultural activities, especially that I've heard many people say, culture is prevention, right? And that's what we want to be able to ensure that like First Nations have the funding to do those kinds of events, to do that kind of that community cohesion, community building, prevention activities. But then also if you have a family who's struggling, with financial needs, with housing insecurity, food insecurity, need childcare, sort of like these kinds of contextual factors that lead children to come into contact with Child and Family Services, but don't meet that threshold for protection. But then once, often ends up happening is because there's a gap in those services. Of course, the agency will want to help. But now we're in a situation where the child is receiving services by the agency, and that opens up potential for additional surveillance that could lead a child to come into care unnecessarily because they can't receive the kinds of support they need on their First Nation. And that's what we really like to see, that First Nations are able to sort of to create that frontline prevention so that children are not coming into contact with unnecessarily for reasons of poverty, ultimately, or reasons of, it might be family poverty, but it also might be other, lack of services on reserve that force the agency to become involved, or force the family or even the band to get the agency involved because there's nothing there to support that family. There's a gap. I hope that helps.
So I know you had mentioned before about First Nations delivering prevention services in terms of like cultural supports. Our next question is, can an agency provide their funding for cultural supports to the First Nation instead?
Yes. So the funding can go between the agency and the First Nation based on, like, again, that community child and community wellness plan. The only funding, the only funding that cannot be moved is prevention funding at the First Nation. And have to go back and look, but the prevention funding that the First Nation gets, it can go into least disruptive measures though, but not protection. So we really want to keep that prevention funding like in the prevention sphere. So if a First Nation, if there's a need for more funding at the tertiary prevention level where the agency is providing, they're saying, like there's like an influx of need for that intensive prevention activities. The First Nation can say, actually, like, we have some funds, we can shoot it over to you from our prevention funding, and that can support least disruptive measures. So there definitely can be funding going between. What we would hope to see is that the need for protection funding over time, and we don't expect this to happen right away. And in fact, we may see different results in the first few years because we're seeing a change in the way that this program is going to work, and we're going to have more people involved, more people to use a very social work technical term, the surveillance. So more people sort of involved in the wellness and in child and family services. So we may see different results in terms of protection and children in care. But what we would want to see a trend over time with less protection needs, and perhaps then we can start redirecting money away from protection and into prevention, whether it's at the agency level for that tertiary least disruptive measures, or back at those community-based services, whoever happens to be the source of that service. I think I may have gotten off track on that question. So let me know if I need to come back to it, Lauren.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of information is good information, Ashley. So anything that can be drawn out from your answers or responses is great. So this is just a comment, and I don't know if you have any comment on the comment, but are you aware that an Ontario agency baseline does not include these disruptive measures? In 2022-23 agencies, LDM were considered prevention and not one of the four, I don't want to say 411, 411 categories. Is that too specific?
No, it could be that. So it's, because again, Ontario has like some specific provisions, but so the direction that agencies received from Indigenous Services Canada was to start, if they're doing prevention, or least disruptive, that least disruptive measures, to start, putting those prevention services under that least disruptive measures. I think it's often it's distinguished in its terminology, but. So in Ontario, though, I don't know what, like, I'm guessing it's a cost category you're mentioning. The agency still should be sort of filing those expenditures under. If it's prevention is the term that is used, it's still to do with that activity at the agency level.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. So this next question is regarding off-reserve children. Why does ISK not include off-reserve children in the population? Who is supporting the children off-reserve? Some First Nations have established offices in urban areas. We need ISK to include them in the funding, as they also are.
Lauren, you just cut out for me in that last section, but I'm taking away that this question is about how off-reserve First Nations children are being served. If there is for example, like a lot of, as I heard, like First Nations who have sort of like urban satellite offices, that funding would be considered part of if those that ordinarily resident. So there could be reasons that families are off reserved temporarily. It could be for educational purposes, could be for medical, it could be for several reasons, but it falls under that ordinarily resident category. So if you're considering yourself in the place of the child, that one of your parents has a sort of that ordinarily resident category, they normally live on reserve, temporarily away from the reserve, they would still, be eligible to receive services from the agency, as long as that agency is established by the First Nation, or is delegated by the First Nation to serve their urban population, which would typically be on reserve. So it comes down to that ordinarily resident. I completely agree that this is like a limitation of the way Indigenous Services Canada counts First Nations. And we know that First Nations consider their off-reserve population to be part of that community. And we know that in a lot of cases, if a First Nation child needs services, but they're not living on reserve, that the First Nation will cash manage, find some way to help that child and the agency too. However, in this case, I wanted to point out that there's actually a forward-looking provision in the draft agreement that I'm actually particularly excited about, because something that I really think is important actually for population is not, we know the limitations of IRS. We know that there's a lot of limitations to that, and we looked at many different counts for population, and unfortunately IRS seemed to be the best for now. However, the First Nations Information Governance Center is working on an approach to a First Nations led census, and we've put in provisions for the first 5-year program assessment to look at how we can leverage the development of a First Nations-led census. So that would be a First Nations defining who their population is for the purposes of service delivery. And that, I think, is really, really key for there to be, equanimity in the way that funding is provided. We do need to very seriously recognize that children often have to move off reserve. Families have to move off reserve for multiple reasons, including lack of housing. So that doesn't penalize the First Nation or those children because there's lack of housing. There's no more space on reserve. That happens. And so what we really want to be able to see at hopefully the 5-year program assessment, that First Nations census is a First Nations led census, we can start incorporating that into the way that population is counted. Oh, I just see a quick question. IRS, it's the Indian Registry System.
Okay, thanks, Ashley. If First Nations are currently looking to take on prevention services but don't have capacity at the moment to deliver those services, what funding can they access under this agreement to ensure they have the necessary resources over several years to establish that capacity to deliver those services?
So I'm not sure if it's just my feed, but I am getting Lauren just breaking up again. But the prevention funding, it doesn't have to necessarily just be for the service delivery. You can certainly use some of that funding for, human resource development, program development. In the meantime, if you want those programs to continue to, or to start running, and you'd like your agency to do that, you can move some of that funding over. So it's important. That's part of that carryover too. We know that, the First Nations are going to get an influx of money, and it's going to take time for them to go, like, what am I going to do with this money? How are we going to expend it? What kind of programs do we want? That's part of that carryover too. So you can earmark that funding for that kind of development. I think, that flexibility, that principle of flexibility, it really, that's where a First Nation can really leverage that principle and say, like, we have some ideas for programs, we need some time to start building on them, and building those ideas, and put the resources, the human resources, the capital. So capital infrastructure is another one. I remember Dr. Blackstock saying at some point, like, where are these people going to offer these services? They can't do it in a snowbank. So I remember, thinking about, yeah, like First Nations needs buildings. And that's where the CHRT 41, which under the draft agreement, if the draft agreement is accepted, the draft agreement, the ongoing, the funding for capital would then be taken over by the agreement. Currently, there's CHRT 41, and you can access that process through Indigenous Services Canada's website to start receiving money for like an assessment for building, or if you have a building ready to go, plans for a building, you can access like funding for that too. So part of that is building the resources. So what you're also going to receive as a First Nation is funding for your capital infrastructure, IT. So putting in your computer systems, putting in any kind of like satellite, if you need to use Starlink or some kind of satellite internet, or expanding your IT networks. You're also going to receive funding. Again, we'll talk about this more in the next information session. Some funding that will top you up for these kind of additional expenditure categories. So that funding will also come in under to the First Nation.
Great. Can you hear me? Am I coming in clear?
No, yeah.
Okay, great. Does the draft agreement commit ISK to including least disruptive measures in baseline that were covered in the 22-23 fiscal year in prevention, and not in intake and investigation, building repairs, or legal? As mentioned in Ontario, agency baseline does not include these disruptive measures, and this was instead considered prevention in 2023.
Yeah, so that is my understanding. Like, again, like it's I'm hoping we can just clarify, like, in the draft agreement, we use least disruptive measures to differentiate from what the funding that the First Nation will get, and it's really to differentiate that mandated prevention activities that the agencies have to offer according to provincial legislation from the non-mandated prevention activities that the First Nation will be able to offer. So if your baseline, or if you were categorizing your like least disruptive measures or your prevention activities, however it was categorized prevention, that will be part of that baseline. But I would really encourage you to call the region, the ISK regional office, because again, like, I can only speak about this quite broadly. So if there's a difference in the way that your agency was categorizing funding, or the way that your agency sort of does that back end bookkeeping, you still will be funded for those activities. But I really encourage you then to speak to the regional ISK office, because I don't want to say something that isn't applicable to your specific situation, but that prevention activity, whether you called it least disruptive measures or whether you called it prevention, that activity is still going to be funded under the baseline. You're going to get the funding for your provincially mandated prevention activities, whether it's called least disruptive measures, least intrusive measures, family enhancement. Some provinces call it family enhancement. It's still going to be a part of that. The First Nation cannot, like, when you don't have that kind of we may be First Nations, of course, they have a social worker, a registered social worker, but it's really that agency's mandate. So that's what's going to, you will receive that kind of funding. Again, really encourage you to call your ISC regional office though, because again, I don't want to say anything that isn't, agencies and specific agencies may have some nuances in their funding that may need to be clarified. So again, encourage you to call that ISC regional office.
Okay, we have about 20-25 minutes until we need to wrap up. So there are a few questions still to go. Ashley, is the housing program you spoke of part of Department of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities Canada?
Mm-hmm. No, ISC has a program called Capital Capital Infrastructure and Maintenance Program. So that's going to be that's the organization within ISC that will administer these funds, and they're going to build in kind of a specialized sub program within there for these funds, because they're temporary. They're not going to be it's not ongoing. So that program will administer those funds and build in some reporting requirements. It's going to be pretty, we've really tried to impress upon Indigenous Services Canada that, reporting requirements for funding going to the First Nation need to be relatively high level and not too burdensome, because we know that reporting at the First Nation is quite intensive and we don't want to add on those additional burdens. But we do want to be, Indigenous Services Canada has to make their case to the government to continue to fund. Also, it's a really important data collection tool. I mean, we know that housing on reserve, like the funding that First Nations are going to get, is a drop in the bucket for what is needed. We absolutely know that. And in fact has a report on the infrastructure gap, and it's billions and billions of dollars that needs to be invested to close the infrastructure gap, and housing is a big part of that. But because this housing funds is the hope is that it's a very specific use for these funds, and it's there to really support children and families at risk of child and family services involvement due to housing, due to lack of housing, due to overcrowding, due to houses that are in need of major repair, that put the child at risk of coming into contact with FNCFS under that sort of nebulous category of neglect, because sometimes we know poverty looks like neglect. So we want to be able to support First Nations with this, with negotiating this kind of funding agreement, so that First Nations have some additional dollars to catch that problem, support that challenge, and then also really help families come back into, for children to be able to reunite with their families when housing remains a barrier. Of course, the agency is in a terrible bind, actually, when a child a child and family may be ready to reunite after a necessary removal, but if the family has lost their family housing, if the house is not in good repair, that can be a barrier to reunification. An agency would be reluctant, and with good reason, to support that reunification if the housing is not in good shape. But what's there then is funding for the First Nation to be able to do necessary repairs, or even I think, Lauren, up in your territory, there's a First Nation who's looking at building reunification specific housing, and then putting in even you have a transitional home. Parents can be there, a social worker or a community leader, elder can be there supporting that family reunification with with housing, with new housing, with healthy housing. So that's one of the ways that First Nations may be able to use this money. And the reporting requirements would just be, to make sure that, or to track how that money is being used. And in fact, it can be used, the data that's collected can be used for further housing investments, because then we start to understand how great the need is, especially for the child and family services involved families.
Okay, thanks, Ashley. Um, what happens to tertiary prevention funding when a First Nation receives services from a mainstream agency?
So the funding that would go, like if you're served by the province, the baseline funding, including that tertiary funding, goes to the province. The First Nation would still get all of the funding for the primary and secondary prevention activities, and then including additional top-ups for IT and infrastructure and those kinds of cost categories. But the baseline would go to that funding is going to go to the province. And Canada is, ISK is working, and we've really had to, work to really get Canada and the provinces kind of aligned with these services. We really want to see the quality of services that is going to be, supported through this funding available to First Nations children who are served by the mainstream agencies. We really should be seeing the same quantity and quality of services.
Thank you so much for that. Are First Nation and agency allocations available to review before the voting takes place?
Unfortunately, that's not something we have access to at the AFN. I don't think anybody would want us to have that information. So again, that would be something that I really hope that the regions, the ISK regions, will be able to roll that information out. I again encourage you to call your regional office, because that's and that's something we have. I want to say that we have actually talked to ISK about, and would like to continue that conversation and making sure that people again have that information and make an informed decision. But unfortunately, that's not something AFN can provide. So yeah.
Also, when are you anticipating the terms and conditions for funding allocations will be released? And if you're able to say this, I know it's probably more of an ISK question, but is ISK ready to undertake their responsibilities?
Oh, Lauren, your microphone shut off before the audio caught up. Is ISK ready to undertake their
response under the FSA?
Oh, definitely a question for ISK. One of the things that I guess I don't want to speak on behalf of ISK. I don't want to, I don't want to speak on behalf of them, but one of the mandates that ISK has, and actually you can read it even in the mandate letter to the current minister, Patty Hajdu, is to start putting program decisions in the hands of First Nations. Some people could refer to it as devolution, or basically moving community programs to in decision making, and the funding that should come with that to the First Nation. So what an agreement like this sees, and even on the C92 side of things, is seeing less involvement in ISK oversight. So again, moving that accountability structure away from the agency, like the agency to ISK, from the agency to the First Nation. So their responsibilities, what I really want to see them do is really implement the changes that they're going to have to their departmental results framework. So that's the data that they're going to be collecting, to something a little bit more to do with they're going to have more responsibility for making sure that First Nations and agencies have what they need, including information, including including funding, including infrastructure, that they're going to start like basically like being able to make sure that they're looking at what gaps exist and how those gaps need to be filled. That's something that I really think that, you know, is a better, instead of meddling in the service level provisions, that's where ISK will be better, sort of better suited, is to make sure that that they're monitoring gaps and taking steps to fill those gaps, especially I think around information and information dissemination. So I really hope that they have what they need, that they're ready to you know, fulfill their end of the bargain, as you might say. But I also see like those service level decisions, the child and family service level decisions, that's no longer going to be with us. That's going to be with the First Nation in collaboration with the agency, you know. So and for the second part on the no, actually the first part of the question, the terms and conditions, they are in draft form. I would I can't say exactly when they'll be ready to be released, but they are in review, and we would like to get some more eyes on them, especially from people who are going to be implementing this program. It has to make sense to the people who are going to be responsible for implementing this program. So I'm hoping that's going to be coming in the, you know, available in the coming weeks. But yeah, again, maybe a bit more of a question for ISK, but it's something that's in the pipeline.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. Do you have any insight into how will disagreements with ISK about what is counted as baseline funding be resolved?
So there's a couple of different, I guess there's a couple of different approaches to this. The first line would be your service provider adjustment request. And then if you go, through the service provider funding adjustment request process, which is supposed to be quite simple and really just like a letter to ISK requesting this, and then it'll be a conversation between your region, the ISK region, and the agency or First Nation and or First Nation. If there is a dispute arising from that, the alternative dispute mechanism is available, not mandatory, but available to First Nations service providers. So if there's a dispute arising that has to do with your funding or another part, like whether it's funding or some other aspect of the agreement you have with implementation, funding, any other kinds of disputes that are arising, you can access the alternative dispute mechanism. It'll be it's First Nations. It'll be First Nations led. It'll be a First Nations like judiciary or someone with a background in judicial expertise who is First Nations will be the president, and there'll be adjudicators who will be sort of appropriate for this environment, and which will be all paid for by Canada. So you won't have to, hire like you don't have to spend money on lawyers. You don't have to go through a lengthy court process. The CHRT would be available as well, but it's a long process. It requires funding from like own source funding to hire like a legal team, unless you can get someone to do pro bono work. But this other stream, this dispute resolution stream, will be available to the service providers as well. I think
Is funding proposal based?
No, funding is not proposal based. The research that we used from IFSD's research, we know proposal based funding it's laborious, it's time consuming. Often First Nations are spending money hiring consultants to do their proposals for them because it's just not reasonable for this kind of funding to be proposal based. The funding, what the kind of structure that we looked at is commonly known as block funding. And in Indigenous Services Canada's funding agreement models, there's several, there's a few different styles of funding. Block funding is the type of funding that comes down, and you might have a First Nation who gets all of their funding for all of their programs, from water to housing to FNCFS to all of their, all in one chunk of money. Well, we can't do that for FNCFS because not everyone is eligible for block funding, and there's not also, we want to make sure that funding stays within the FNCFS because we don't want money moved around. And when I say we, responding to, to the concerns of First Nations and agencies, that, money shouldn't be able to move out of the program. We want the money to stay in the program. So this way of doing this funding is kind of based on that block approach, which means that the funding you will get as a First Nation or an agency, you're going to get a single envelope of funding. And there'll be sort of, again, that notionally allocated based on your expenditures. And if you're a First Nation who's never received this kind of funding, it may come as a sort of, again, that notional allocation, but it's up to the recipient to then be like, we can move some of this money over from, IT. Maybe your IT is in good shape. Maybe you can take some of your IT funding and move it over into prevention. Maybe you want to use it for carryover because in a couple of years, your infrastructure and your IT infrastructure, is going to need revamping, or that you're going to get broadband or something like this. And so maybe you carry over some of that IT funding for future use. So you're not going to have to write proposals. You just will have to do some reporting on your expenditures. Again, keeping it, that expenditure reporting pretty light, especially for the First Nation level, to not add additional burden on reporting, because we do know, we've been told, and we really hear reporting is very burdensome. We at the AFN have to do all kinds of reporting too, and it's not the funnest part of the job.
Thank you, Ashley. So we know that our time today is drawing to a close. We have about 3 questions left, and if you have provided a question after the last one today, please feel free to send us any questions, comments, feedback to social.development@afn.ca, and we'll be sure to follow up with you. So the next question is a follow-up regarding the capacity conversation. Do we have to draw from prevention funds to build capacity? If a First Nations notional allocation for prevention is $75,000, for example, but they require $500,000 to set up the program over a couple of years, where do they get resources to build this up?
That is a really great question. And like I was saying, there's a lot of the funding that's going to be coming under to the First Nation can be used, whether it's notionally allocated to IT or to capital or to other funding expenditures. It's all part of this package of funding that will be used for the buildup of your programs if you want to do that kind of program. So and then, there's also other programs that can be used. So like education, if you're looking at, you want to support community, people in your community to, get some kind of designation, it's our education or something like that, then you might start looking at other sources of funding. But the funding here, you will see that there is different streams of funding coming under that broader package of FNCFS funding for the First Nation that you can leverage to start putting in your resources like buildings and IT and just furniture, that you can use. Then you might want to look at other types of funding. So what maybe not included, but you actually probably could make a pretty good argument to include in if you needed to draw from your prevention money to support education. But I understand what you're saying. Like that's, maybe you don't want to do that, and that's good reasons. And you want to start looking at maybe some other types of programs available to First Nations for education, this kind of thing. I know that maybe not was like the most helpful answer, but that I could, if we know the question, I think the back end team knows the person that question is coming from. So maybe we can sort of chat a little bit after too about some ways of addressing those kinds of like human resources staffing kind of needs too.
Thanks. What funding will provinces receive under the FSA?
So the province, if it's an agency that if it's mainstream agencies that are doing the services to First Nations, they will receive what would be under the baseline. And then I'm not sure if that's a sort of an answer as is needed. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if there's other information or requested, just for the participants, just again email us, and we'll try to respond with other information if we can provide that. And coming to the close, who determines funding sufficiency, and if a First Nation or agency has the funding they need?
So the like I said, like the funding is based on actuals reimbursed at the from previous years. So it has to do with your previous year spending, and then again topped up for inflation, population growth. So you're receiving money that is commensurate to previous years plus those adjustments for population and inflation. If your money is not sufficient, that's when you would go through the service provider adjustment process. The sufficiency of funding, we looked at a wide variety of principles to do with what is sufficient, what is adequate. And that, comes with a lot of research that, we, again, the IFSD under contract and direction of the AFN conducted research within, with agencies, with First Nations to look at what would be needed. So costing out the suite of reforms. So that research has been going on. I mean, the third phase of research, which is the costing part, has been done, and that was very much used to implement to write the agreement and figure out how much money would be required to fund these reforms, and then broken down using population counts, using your previous fiscal years actual expenditures, using I already said population, but then that inflation part of it. So the sufficiency of funding has to do with your previous funding and the growth, inflation, population, as well as looking at everything that would be required, how much funding would be required across the whole program. So that's where we arrive at the $47.8 billion. Again, if accepted by First Nations and at the special Chiefs Assembly in September, all of this is contingent on that. So that sufficiency is a combination of research, number crunching, and then also your previous expenditures. So it's no one who, and it's multiple levels of um, um, approaches to how we like how the money will be allocated. And again, the AFN, we're not the ones who hold the numbers. We don't, and we also don't we're not administering the money. It's all coming from ISK and also in your region. So again, if you're, questions about that, what that funding is going to look like, absolutely contact the region, work in consultation with your First Nation. And then again, if it's not sufficient, if you're finding that the money is not sufficient to offer the services that you've been offering, then you would go through that, and that you're mandated to offer, then you would go through that process, the service provider adjustment.
Okay, thanks, Ashley. I just have one tiny question to add in there. Is there a limit to how many years funding can be carried over?
Yeah, this is a good question. So the FSA says, the draft agreement, it talks about a 1 year, like you can carry over to the next fiscal year. Money can be carried over though if it's, if you have unexpended funding plans. So currently, if you have unexpended funding plans, if you can say, well, we have this money, but we want to spend it, and there's multiple years that you're going to have spending plans. If you have that money earmarked for future spending, have at her. You're going to have to fill out some forms ultimately. But the money though, but there'll be a point at which, again, it has to do with the way ISK has to justify the amount of money that's going into this program, that they need to know that money is earmarked. As long as they know the money is earmarked, it can, it's part of your funding agreement. I want to just say too that if you have carryover from this year, you'll have to have an unexpended funding program, but then the ISK will just reload your funding agreement with the next year's like next fiscal year's funding. So again, that's a question for ISK. I can provide some information, but your specific agency and your specific, like the First Nation in that specific context, I really encourage you to talk to the region, to the ISK region.
Thank you, Ashley, for a great discussion today and for taking the time to share this important information about protection funding in the draft agreement with us. You can take a breath now, have a drink of water. I think we've gone through all the questions. We've had over 120 participants join us today, and the session recording and presentation will be available online. As we know, there were some who wanted to be here but couldn't join us live today. So in addition to these virtual sessions, many of the AFN regions are also hosting engagement sessions with their First Nations in the coming weeks. So I encourage you to contact your regional office to learn more about these sessions. Today's session has been enlightening to know about the way protection funding will be delivered under the draft agreement and to better understand how the proposed reforms will support our children and families. I trust that the chiefs, proxies, technicians, and others who are with us today have enjoyed hearing this information. And as a reminder, you'll be able to access the presentation materials from today's session in the coming days. Thank you all for joining us today, and we hope to see you in 2 weeks' time at the next virtual information session on August 22nd. That session will be focused on prevention, funding, and services in the draft agreement. So I would now like to turn the session over to Elder Edmund Sackney to provide us with a closing prayer.
Thank you, Migach. So much has been covered today. You can see the interest is there, and the complexity of this issue is a very important issue because it involves our children. It involves the toddlers, the infants, even the ones that are still coming. For me, one of the where most of the answers will come from for a lot of these questions will be coming from the community. Because the community, I've talked to the grandparents, the great grandparents that became caregivers of children that didn't go into the system. And they have done very well. And a lot of them did not have funding for this. They just did it on their own because that's the way it was. That's the way it should be. And if we're going to look for direction or questions on childcare policy, we have to go within because it's a healing process. Any person that wants to heal doesn't immediately go out. They have to go within to look for those questions, to look for those answers. Humility, that's what that's all about. Then once they obtain that humility with all that information they gather, then the humbleness comes in. That's when they show the people where they are. So that's, and as communities, we need to learn to speak to each other, to love each other, to respect each other, and all this, because you got to remember, folks, what we're talking about today has been brought to us since they first came to the shores of the Mi'kmaq, the Maliseet. That's when it all started. And it came westward. So we're talking about hundreds of years of settlement, enforced policy, ill-advised policies, because it was directly coming from them. Now we're trying to turn that around through this funding that we'll speak of today. And it will happen. It's going to happen, but we have to start learning from within our communities. That's where it's going to start from. And I'm a little concerned about ISK for the simple reason is that they still have that colonial attitude, the colonial of control, that sort of thing. When I pray every morning, the response I get back with regard to this issue, it has to come from the families. It has to come from the homes. It's they have a narrow, very narrow horse view on our community, and that's chief and council. Well, they're an important entity. I'll certainly admit that, but they're not the only entity because when it comes to children, who would know better than the caregivers? I mean, it's so complicated because when we talk about poverty, I always mention to people that I talk to that holistic poverty. That's where we're at. And education, where we have poverty in that because we still have to develop our education system that's going to come to par with a lot of these policies. Physical, that is should not be overlooked because we're being assaulted by numerous diseases. For example, cancer, the water, autism, which is becoming a growing issue, that sort of thing. That's a physical assault. Then we have diabetes and so on and so on. You name it. We have it in our communities. Then we have the emotional. We have to start relearning our emotional way of doing things or responding to situations. And we did have in the past. We did. Because I used to ask my granny, Welcome, did we have abuse, be it sexual family? She says, yes, we did. But it was not a commonality, very rarely. And when it did happen, as a community, as families, we got together and really talked about it and made recommendations to correct it. We had it. It was a way of governing our people. But since the settlers came, that was all taken, and they came with their own system, which did not coexist with ours. As a matter of fact, our way of looking at the world was looked down upon. So, with this issue here, the communities will have to respond because when it comes right down to it, that's where it starts. In my area, we have about 7 communities. In 5 of those communities, we have these mini educational campuses that are that are attached to the technology of delivering information. Certainly, when this comes out in full bloom, I'm going to arrange something with the family care workers and say, why don't we educate our families, our grannies and grandpas, our great ones who looked after our children, even the parents, by having a session at these mini campuses that we have. And, like each community is unique, each First Nation is unique. What will work here doesn't necessarily mean it will work in Cache or at Wabasket. They have their own unique way. Yes, there are commonalities. We need to look at those and build on that. So it's going to be an interesting few months because, it concerns me that we still have to approach the regional office for funding because their history is not that great. So as a people, as communities, we have to create our own way of dealing with situations. And I believe we can do it. I strongly believe that because we now have the young people who have educated themselves and who make sacrifices to get this accreditation on education. They have to leave home. They have to leave their language behind. They have to leave their support services behind. That's the list goes on. And yet they succeeded. And I think this is what's going to happen here with this, what Ashley talk about. It's going to happen, but we need to give ourselves time and be goal oriented as to where we're going to be 3 years from now. We have to start thinking like that. Where is Fort Albany going to be in 5 years in regards to childcare? And how do we work with our regional family agency that covers this, that mandated to cover this area from the province? How do we work with them? We have to. Our history, we've seen them as adversaries, and we have to unlearn that and come up with our own common approach. They want what we want, is that to have good, healthy families and children to be put in a place where they can foster positive growth. Everything, like we have to deal with the holistic view on this. The addictions, not only the physical poverty, but the 3 other entities. So it was a good discussion today. Some of you may not got the answers what you were looking for, or your question wasn't brought forward. That's okay because there's going to be a time that it's going to do whatever concern will appear. So I'm just pleased that I'm part of this. I've seen what people have gone through to get here to where we're at today. And after September 17, 18, whatever, then it's going to be laid out and we'll all have the shared challenges of coming up with resolutions of few that's going to benefit the individual, the families, the communities, and the nations. That's how I want to end this. Hopefully, I provided some food for thought, and I wish you all well for this day and for the future happenings. And to every one of you that are working on this issue, I really want to thank you for your efforts. My apologies to Lauren at the beginning. I didn't realize we had people on the line but she's the young lady that's took on her huge responsibility, and I'm sure she will succeed and find her own groove, her own edge in what she's doing. Mingwich, Missaway, Ashley, everyone that was involved in this. Good afternoon and take care.
Chimiigwech, Elder Ed, for always leaving us in those calming, gentle words and ways that you speak. So I just want to say thank you all again for attending, and that's the wrap on this session. We will see you in 2 weeks. Miigwech.